Picture this. A woman who endured decades of unimaginable hardship walks through the grand doors of her former prison, not as a servant, but as its owner. In one audacious move, she flips the script on history, turning a symbol of oppression into a beacon of triumph. Welcome to the jaw-dropping story of Mary Thompson, a tale of courage, cunning, and defiance that will leave you speechless. If you're new here, smash that subscribe button and buckle up as we uncover a story that proves the impossible is possible. Beaufort, North Carolina, had always been a place where time seemed suspended between past and present. Around 1797, when Mary was born, the town breathed air heavy with sea salt and something heavier, the smell of human sweat that fed the tobacco plantation stretching as far as the eye could see. The Hammond plantation house rose like a white sentinel on wooden pillars, its wide verandas offering a privileged view of the Newport River. It was an imposing structure designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. Every wooden plank, every carefully carved column had been paid for with the labor of people who could never dream of owning something similar. William Hammond, the family patriarch, carried in his eyes the hardness of one who had sailed the seas before settling on land. A former ship captain, he had brought to the plantation the same rigid discipline that maintained order on the high seas. His wife, Elizabeth Carter Hammond, supervised the house with an iron fist disguised in silk gloves. Mary grew up in this environment where every movement was watched, every word weighed, every breath controlled. From childhood, she learned that there were spaces where she could step and others where her presence was an offense. The kitchen, the back of the house, the service quarters. These were her domains. The main parlor, the library, the master's bedrooms, forbidden territories where she entered only to clean, always in silence, always invisible. The days dragged on in a routine that seemed carved in stone. Mary woke before dawn, when the sky was still a dark canvas dotted with stars, her hands, still young but already calloused, prepared the coffee that the masters would drink from fine porcelain cups. She served dishes she would never taste, cleaned furniture she could never use, washed clothes she would never wear. The Carter house, the Hammonds' urban residence in Beaufort, was even more oppressive. Located in the heart of the city's most noble district, the two-story mansion boasted Doric columns and tall windows that seemed like ever-watchful eyes. There, Mary observed fragments of the White family's intimate life, their occasional financial discussions, their variable moods, their daily routines that dictated the rhythm of her own existence. When William Hammond died in 1817, Mary did not inherit freedom. She was inherited. She passed from the hands of the dead captain to those of the widow Elizabeth, as if she were a valuable piece of furniture being transferred from one room to another. The transition was marked by a cold and meticulous inventory where Mary was listed among silverware and furniture, her value estimated in dollars like any other material good. Elizabeth Carter Hammond was a woman of delicate appearance who hid an iron will. Under her supervision, Mary's routine became even more rigid. Each task had a specific time, each movement a defined purpose. The lady of the house watched everything with eyes that seemed capable of seeing through walls, detecting the slightest hesitation, the smallest sign of resistance. The years passed like pages of a book that Mary could not read. She watched the Hammond daughters grow up, marry, leave for their own lives. Catherine Lawrence Bell and Sarah Hammond Wright inherited not only the family's wealth, but also the people who sustained it. Mary passed from one generation of masters to the next, like a family tradition that perpetuated itself without question. During formal meals, Mary served in absolute silence, moving like a shadow among guests who discussed politics, business, and social gossip. Occasionally, she caught fragments of conversations about buying and selling people like her, about cotton and tobacco prices, about the profits that her own labor generated. She was a silent witness to a world that saw her as property, not as a person. The nights were perhaps the most disturbing moments. When the house finally fell silent and the masters slept, Mary remained awake in her small room at the back, listening to the nocturnal sounds of the mansion, wood creaking, wind in the windows, occasional footsteps in the corridors. Sometimes lying in her narrow bed, she wondered if the walls of the house absorbed the suffering of all the people who had worked there over the years. The Carter house kept secrets in every room. Mary knew the drawers where the masters kept important documents, knew which rooms were used for private meetings, observed the family tensions that unfolded in the corridors. She was an involuntary repository of information that could affect the family, but her condition made her simultaneously the person who observed the most and who could speak the least. Sundays brought a pause in the routine, but not in surveillance. Mary attended religious services intended for the enslaved, where white preachers spoke about obedience and resignation. The words echoed in the small wooden chapel, mixing with the suffocating heat and the smell of tired bodies. It was a religion that preached acceptance of suffering as divine will, a theology that justified oppression as natural order. During these early years, Mary developed an almost supernatural ability to become invisible. She learned to move without making noise, to work without drawing attention, to exist without bothering. It was a survival skill that required constant suppression of her own humanity. Each day was an exercise in self-annulment, a practice of becoming less so that others could be more. Mary's transformation from child to woman happened under the watchful eyes of the Hammonds, but her emotional and psychological maturity developed in secret, in the hidden spaces of her mind, where the masters could not penetrate. There she kept dreams she dared not express, anger she could not show, hopes that seemed impossible to realize. As the years accumulated, Mary began to perceive patterns in the masters' lives, their fears, their insecurities, their dependencies. She noticed how they depended completely on the work that she and others provided, how their wealth was built on foundations they themselves did not fully understand. It was knowledge she kept carefully, not knowing that one day it would be crucial for her survival. During the long winter nights, when the wind blew strong from the ocean and the house groaned under pressure, Mary sometimes allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to live in freedom. These were dangerous thoughts that she quickly suppressed, but that planted seeds of possibility in her mind. She could not predict that these seeds would one day grow and flourish in ways no one could imagine. Around 1825, when Mary had already spent almost 3 decades serving the Hammond family, something changed in her life in a subtle but profound way. John, a man also enslaved by the same family, began appearing more frequently around the Carter house. He worked mainly on the island plantation, but was occasionally sent to the city for specific tasks. The courtship between Mary and John happened in stolen intervals between tasks, in whispered conversations in the kitchen after the master slept, in glances exchanged during Sunday services. It was a romance that needed to be lived in the shadows, because even their most intimate feelings were subject to the owner's approval. Love for people in their condition was a dangerous luxury that could be interrupted at any moment by a sale, a transfer, or a whim of the master's. When Mary and John finally united, there was no official ceremony, no legal documents, no formal recognition of their union. They simply began living as husband and wife, a decision they made on their own, but that depended entirely on the Hammonds' tolerance. It was a marriage that existed in legal twilight, recognized by the enslaved community, but ignored by law. Mary's first pregnancy brought a complex mixture of joy and terror. The joy of creating life, of continuing her lineage, of experiencing motherhood. The terror of knowing that the child she carried in her womb would not belong to her, that it would be Hammond property from the first breath. It was a motherhood marked by the fundamental contradiction of bearing children she could not completely protect. Samuel was born first, a boy with sharp eyes who from early on demonstrated an intelligence that drew attention. Mary watched him grow with a mixture of pride and apprehension, knowing that a very intelligent child could be seen as both a valuable asset and a potential threat. She taught him to be smart enough to survive, but not so much as to arouse suspicion. William came next, then Joseph, David, and Benjamin. Each birth was a miracle and a curse. Mary developed elaborate strategies to keep her children close, silently negotiating with the masters, demonstrating that a united family was more productive than a dispersed family. It was a constant psychological game where she needed to prove the economic value of family unity. Emma was the only girl among the first children, and her arrival brought specific concerns. Mary knew that enslaved women faced particular vulnerabilities, that her daughter would grow up in a world where her body would not completely belong to her. She began teaching Emma from early on to protect herself, to be strong without seeming defiant, to navigate the specific dangers that awaited a young black woman in a slave-holding society. Charles, Michael, and a second William completed the family over the following years. 9 children in total, each representing a victory against the statistical odds that separated enslaved families. Mary and John achieved something many considered impossible, keeping all their children together during decades of captivity. The logistics of raising 9 children under slavery conditions was a monumental challenge. Mary needed to work long hours in the big house while simultaneously caring for babies and small children. She developed a system where the older children helped care for the younger ones, creating a family support network that functioned even when she was absent. The family's meals took place at the back of the property, in a small room that served as home for Mary, John, and the children. The food was simple. Leftovers from the big house, vegetables grown in a small garden that Mary maintained, occasionally a little meat when there were leftovers. But these meals were sacred moments where the family could exist as a unit, where they could speak freely, where they could be complete humans for a few minutes. Mary told stories to her children about traditions she had learned from older people, about the importance of keeping alive the memory of who they were before being someone's property. These stories were whispered in the dark, transmitted as precious secrets that connected the family to a past that the masters tried to erase. John worked mainly in the tobacco fields of the island, returning to the Carter house only on weekends and occasionally during the week when necessary. His constant absence meant that Mary carried alone most of the responsibility of raising the children. She had become simultaneously mother and father, protector and provider, teacher and guardian. The children grew up watching their mother navigate the complex world of the big house. They saw how she changed posture when the masters appeared, how her voice became lower, how her movements became more careful. It was a daily lesson about survival, about how to exist in a world that denied their humanity. During childhood illnesses, Mary became nurse and doctor. She knew medicinal herbs, knew how to make healing teas, had knowledge of folk medicine that had been transmitted through generations of enslaved women. When one of the children fell ill, she spent sleepless nights caring for the child while still needing to fulfill her obligations in the big house the next day. Punishments were a constant reality that hung over the family. Mary knew that any inappropriate behavior from one of the children could result in severe punishments. She developed a system of preventive discipline, teaching the children to anticipate problems, to avoid situations that could arouse the master's anger, to become invisible when necessary. The children's religious education happened on 2 layers. There was the official religion preached in Sunday services, which emphasized obedience and resignation. And there was the spirituality that Mary shared at home, a faith that spoke of justice, of hope, of a future that could be different from the present. As the children grew, Mary began to observe their individual talents. Samuel showed aptitude for learning trades, so she began discreetly negotiating for him to learn tailoring. William showed interest in carpentry. Each child had specific skills that Mary tried to cultivate, always within the limits of what was permitted. The children's adolescence brought new challenges. The boys began questioning why they needed to obey people they considered intellectually inferior. Mary needed to teach them to channel this anger productively, to use their intelligence to survive and prosper within the system, not to confront it directly. Emma, as she grew, began attracting unwanted attention. Mary intensified her vigilance, teaching her daughter protection strategies, creating support networks among other women in the house. It was a delicate dance between protecting her daughter and not arousing suspicions about her intentions. The years passed and the Thompson family remained united, an extraordinary feat at a time when enslaved families were routinely separated. Mary had achieved something that defied statistics and expectations, raising 9 children to adulthood without losing any to sales, diseases, or fatal accidents. During the long winter nights when the family gathered in their small room, Mary sometimes allowed herself to dream of a different future. She could not imagine exactly what it would be like, but she felt that changes were coming. There were signs in the air, whispered conversations among the masters, tensions she did not fully understand, but that she recognized as significant. The relationship between Mary and John deepened during these difficult years. They developed a form of almost telepathic communication capable of transmitting complex information through glances and subtle gestures. It was an intimacy forged by the necessity of survival, a connection that transcended the limitations imposed by their condition. As the children matured, Mary began preparing them for possibilities she herself could not clearly articulate. She taught them to be self-sufficient, to think for themselves, to value family above all. These were lessons that seemed simple on the surface, but that carried deeper meanings about resistance, dignity, and hope. In 1848, when Elizabeth Carter Hammond died, Mary experienced for the second time in her life the disturbing sensation of being inventoried as property. At 51 years old, she had spent more than half of her existence serving the Hammond family. But her experience, her loyalty, her years of dedicated service meant nothing beyond monetary value in a cold and impersonal legal document. The inventory process was conducted with the same meticulousness applied to furniture and silverware. Mary, John, and their 9 children were individually appraised, their values estimated based on age, health, skills, and productive potential. It was a dehumanizing process that reduced decades of life, love, suffering, and growth to numbers on a spreadsheet. Catherine Lawrence Bell and Sarah Hammond Wright, the inheriting daughters, divided their mother's property with the coldness of those dividing antique furniture. Mary and her family were distributed between the 2 sisters as if they were decorative objects without consideration for the family bonds that had taken decades to form and strengthen. It was during this period that Mary adopted Carter as part of her name, a bitter irony that she embraced with a deep understanding of its meaning. Becoming Mary Carter Thompson was not just a matter of identification. It was a recognition that her identity had been shaped by the people who owned her, that even her name carried the marks of her condition. The transition to the control of the Hammond daughters brought subtle but significant changes. Catherine Bell, in particular, demonstrated an obsessive need for control and order. She implemented new supervision systems, stricter schedules, more severe punishments for minor infractions. It was as if she felt the need to prove her authority more explicitly than her mother. Mary observed these changes with the patience of one who had learned to survive through adaptation. She adjusted her routine, modified her behavior, taught the children to navigate the new expectations. But beneath this apparent submission, something was changing in her mind. During this period, Mary began to notice subtle changes in the master's behavior. There were conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered the room, private meetings that happened at unusual times, a general tension that permeated the house. She realized that something significant was approaching, although she could not predict exactly what it would be. Each task was timed, each movement observed, each interaction with other household staff monitored. It was like living under a microscope where even the most natural gestures were analyzed for signs of insubordination. Mary developed increasingly sophisticated strategies to protect her family. She learned to anticipate the ladies' moods, to divert their attention when one of the children made a minor mistake, to absorb criticisms and punishments that could have been directed at the children. It was a constant psychological game that required tremendous emotional energy. During the nights when the house finally fell silent, Mary remained awake, planning. She had begun imagining hypothetical scenarios. What would happen if the family was sold? How she could keep the children together? What skills they would need to survive independently? These were mental exercises that helped her feel less powerless in the face of an uncertain future. The political tensions that Mary occasionally perceived in the master's conversations began to intensify visibly. There were more frequent discussions about politics, about economic changes, about external pressures. Mary absorbed this fragmented information, building a basic but growing understanding of the context that would shape her future. During this period, Mary also observed changes in the Hammond family's domestic economy. There was less money for luxuries, more concern about expenses, conversations about financial difficulties. She realized that the wealth that seemed so solid and permanent was in fact built on more fragile foundations than it appeared. The older children began taking on greater responsibilities both in the house and in protecting the younger siblings. Samuel, in particular, demonstrated leadership qualities that Mary recognized as valuable but potentially dangerous. She needed to teach him to use these skills in ways that would benefit the family without arousing suspicion. Mary also observed changes in Beaufort's broader social dynamics. There were more night patrols, more restrictions on enslaved people's movements, more paranoia among white owners. It was as if the entire society was preparing for something, although no one knew exactly what it would be. During Sunday services, Mary noticed that the sermons had become more emphatic about obedience and resignation. The white preachers seemed more anxious, their messages more urgent. It was as if they were trying to reinforce a system they felt was under threat, although they did not admit this openly. The letters that arrived at the Carter house brought news from other states, other plantations, other families. Mary, through fragments of conversations, occasionally caught pieces of this information. The news was not good. There were reports of tensions, changes, instability everywhere. As 1862 approached, Mary felt a change in the air that went beyond the seasons. It was as if the entire social structure that had defined her life was beginning to tremble at its foundations. She could not predict what would come, but her instincts, honed by decades of survival, told her that monumental changes were approaching. It was a dangerous thought, almost blasphemous in its audacity. But once planted in her mind, it began to grow like a seed in fertile soil, nourished by decades of accumulated knowledge and a growing understanding that the world was about to change in ways no one could completely predict. During the long winter nights when the wind blew strong from the ocean, Mary sometimes allowed herself to dream of possibilities that seemed impossible. They were not specific dreams, but vague feelings that perhaps, just perhaps, the future could be different from the past. It was a dangerous hope, but one she kept carefully in her heart. The children perceived the subtle change in their mother, although they could not articulate exactly what was different. There was a new quality in her eyes, a different way of observing the house and the masters. It was as if she was seeing everything through a slightly different lens, calculating possibilities that had not existed before. Mary had learned over decades to be patient, to wait, to observe. But now, for the first time, she began to feel that perhaps patience could have a purpose beyond mere survival. Perhaps all the observation, all the accumulated knowledge, all the understanding of her oppressor's weaknesses and strengths could one day serve a greater purpose. It was a subtle but profound transformation happening in Mary's mind. She was still the same woman who served in silence, who obeyed orders, who kept her family together through careful strategies. But beneath this familiar appearance, something new was being born. A vision of possibilities she could not yet name, but that she felt growing within her like an irresistible force. On the morning of November 9, 1863, the sound of Union cannons echoed across Beaufort Harbor like thunder, announcing the end of a world. Mary was in the Carter house kitchen, preparing the morning coffee when the first booms made the porcelain cups tremble on the shelves. It was a sound she had never heard before, but that she instinctively recognized as the harbinger of monumental changes. Panic spread through the house like fire in dry straw. Catherine Bell ran through the corridors shouting contradictory orders, while Sarah Wright frantically packed valuable objects into trunks and suitcases. It was the first time Mary had seen the masters completely lose their composure, and the sight was simultaneously satisfying and terrifying. Within hours, Beaufort's white elite transformed into a desperate crowd fleeing their own homes. Overloaded carriages raced through the streets toward the interior, carrying families who had never known real fear. It was what would later be known as the Great Beaufort Stampede. Mary observed the frantic preparation for flight with a mixture of fascination and disbelief. For decades, she had seen these same people exercise absolute control over every aspect of her life. Now they ran like frightened children, abandoning everything they could not carry in their hands. Catherine Bell, in her haste, shouted incoherent instructions to Mary about what to do with the house during her absence. Her words were contradictory, spoken by someone who had completely lost control of the situation. Mary nodded and murmured appropriate responses, but inside she felt a strange calm, as if she were watching the collapse of a nightmare from which she was finally awakening. The list of abandoned properties that the Hammonds would later present to Confederate authorities revealed the mentality that had defined Mary's life for decades. Among one dinner set $45 and table linens $58, she appeared listed as Mary Carter Thompson, approximate age 66 years, valued like any other material good left behind. But there was something deeply disturbing about how the list was prepared. Mary was not just abandoned, she was being inventoried as financial loss. Her children, Samuel, Benjamin, Charles, Michael, and Emma, also appeared on the list, along with other people who may have been relatives: Lila, Clara, Philip, Jonah, another David, and an unnamed baby only 5 months old. The irony was sharp as a blade. Throughout her life, Mary had been treated as valuable property, carefully preserved and maintained. Now, at the moment when the masters most needed their goods, they abandoned her like furniture too heavy to transport. It was a brutal revelation about the true value she had in their eyes. When the last carriages disappeared down the dusty road, a strange silence descended over the Carter house. Mary walked through the empty rooms, her steps echoing differently in spaces that suddenly seemed larger, emptier, less oppressive. It was as if the very architecture of the house had changed with the master's departure. For the first time in her life, Mary entered the main parlor without carrying a tray, without having a specific task, without needing to justify herself. She sat in the velvet armchair, where Catherine Bell used to receive visitors, feeling the soft fabric against her skin. It was a simple act, but loaded with revolutionary meaning. The following days brought a gradual but profound transformation. Union soldiers occupied Beaufort, establishing barracks in the abandoned mansions. Northern missionaries arrived with books, medicines, and ideas about education and freedom. It was the beginning of what would be known as the Port Royal Experiment, the United States' first real attempt to rebuild a society on the ruins of slavery. Mary observed these changes with the caution of one who had learned to distrust promises from white people. But there was something different about these new occupants. They spoke to her directly, looked into her eyes, asked her opinion on practical matters. It was a disconcerting experience after decades of forced invisibility. The work continued, but now with a fundamental difference. Mary received payment, real dollars, coins she could keep, monetary value that recognized her work as contribution, not obligation. During the nights, Mary counted and recounted her coins, not out of greed, but out of disbelief. Each cent represented a recognized hour of work, a valued effort, a respected contribution. It was the first time in her life that her time had official monetary value. Her children also began receiving payment for their services. Samuel, who had learned tailoring, discovered that his skills were much sought after by Union soldiers who needed fitted uniforms and clothing repairs. William found work as a carpenter, helping repair buildings damaged during the occupation. But Mary had plans that went beyond daily work. During the long nights, she calculated and recalculated, adding up every cent earned, estimating how long it would take to accumulate a significant amount. There was something specific she wanted to buy, a goal she kept secret even from John. The Carter house remained empty, its windows looking at the street like blind eyes. Mary passed by it daily, observing how the paint peeled, how the garden plants grew wildly, how the structure that had once symbolized absolute power now seemed vulnerable and abandoned. During this period, Mary began attending community meetings organized by Northern missionaries. She heard discussions about rights, about education, about economic opportunities. These were concepts she had contemplated in secret for decades, but that were now discussed openly as real possibilities instead of impossible dreams. Beaufort's transformation was visible every day. Houses that had been symbols of oppression became schools, hospitals, community centers. The city's social geography was being rewritten, and Mary observed each change with the attention of one who understood she was witnessing history being made. But behind all this apparent transformation, Mary maintained constant vigilance. She had lived long enough to know that political changes could be reversed, that promises could be broken, that conquered freedom could be lost. She needed something more permanent, more tangible, more irrevocable. During the first weeks after the Union occupation, there was silent but palpable resistance from some whites who remained in the city. Mary felt hostile looks when she walked the streets, heard whispered comments about blacks who didn't know their place. The racial tension that had always existed now manifested in more open and dangerous ways. Some Union soldiers also demonstrated prejudices that Mary recognized, although expressed differently from Southerners. There was a paternalistic condescension in some, genuine surprise, when they discovered that people like her were capable of independent thought and sophisticated planning. Mary navigated these tensions with the same skills she had developed during decades of slavery. She knew when to speak and when to remain silent, when to assert herself, and when to retreat strategically. It was a complex social dance that required constant vigilance and adaptation. It was during one of these nights of silent planning that Mary made a decision that would change not only her life, but the course of her family's history. She had accumulated enough money, had identified the opportunity, had calculated the risks. It was time to do something that no person in her condition had ever attempted in Beaufort. The plan she had been developing in secret for months was about to be put into action. It was audacious to the point of madness. But Mary had learned that moments of social chaos created opportunities that did not exist in normal times. And if there was one thing she had learned during decades of silent observation, it was how to recognize and seize opportunities when they presented themselves. But even while planning, Mary was aware of the dangers surrounding her. Society was in flux, but that did not mean racial prejudices had disappeared. On the contrary, in many cases, they became more virulent in the face of the threat of social change. She knew that any misstep could result in devastating consequences for her and her family. The courage necessary for what she was planning was not the impulsive courage of youth, but the calculated courage of someone who had survived decades of oppression through intelligence, patience, and determination. It was the courage of someone who understood exactly what she was risking and chose to proceed anyway. During the last weeks before putting her plan into action, Mary observed the Carter house with new eyes. It was no longer just the place of her suffering, it was also the symbol of her future victory. Every room she had cleaned, every stair she had climbed carrying trays, every corner where she had been forced to hide. All of this would become hers when she executed her audacious plan. The irony was not lost on her. The same house that had been designed to demonstrate white superiority and black inferiority was about to become the exact symbol of the opposite. It was a transformation that went far beyond the merely personal. It was a statement about the possibilities of radical social change. The morning of February 13, 1865 dawned cold and clear in Beaufort with a cutting breeze coming from the ocean carrying the smell of change. The city courthouse had been busy since early morning with men in top hats and military uniforms gathering for what would be one of the most significant auctions in North Carolina history, the sale of properties abandoned by fleeing Confederates. Mary arrived at the courthouse wearing her best dress, a simple but clean fabric she had sewn with special care for this occasion. In her worn leather bag, she carried $280 in coins and bills, each cent representing months of hard work, rigorous saving, and meticulous planning. It was more money than she had ever seen together in her entire life. The auctioneer, a corpulent man with a graying mustache, organized his papers on the improvised table while the crowd settled in. There were Union officers interested in properties for military use, Northern speculators seeking lucrative investments, and a few locals who had remained loyal to the Union. Mary was the only black woman present, a fact that did not go unnoticed by the other participants. When the auction began, Mary observed in silence while properties were sold one after another. Entire plantations changed hands for values that seemed simultaneously enormous and ridiculously low. It was like watching the dismemberment of a world that had seemed eternal and immutable. Lot B, Block 14, Franklin Street, announced the auctioneer with a strong voice that echoed through the courthouse. House known as Carter, property of Catherine Lawrence Bell, abandoned during the Confederate evacuation. Opening bid, $230. Mary felt her heart accelerate. It was the house where she had spent decades serving, cleaning, cooking, suffering in silence. The house whose secrets she had kept, whose walls had witnessed her transformation from child to woman, from enslaved to free person. Some bids were made by speculators who saw the property only as an investment. The house was well located in the heart of Beaufort's most noble district, an area known as the Point, where the city's most impressive mansions lined tree-lined streets. It was valuable property by any standard. When the bid reached $270, Mary raised her hand. $280, she said with a clear and firm voice that cut through the crowd's murmur like a blade. The silence that followed was deafening. Heads turned, eyes widened, Whispers began circulating through the room. A black woman, formerly enslaved, was making a bid at an auction of confiscated properties. It was something no one had imagined possible. The auctioneer hesitated for a moment, clearly disconcerted by the situation. He looked at the union officers present, as if seeking guidance on how to proceed. But the laws were clear. Any person with money could participate in the auction, regardless of race or previous condition. But the crowd's reaction was immediate and hostile. Voices rose in protest, some shouting that it was an affront to decency, others questioning whether that Negro had the legal right to participate. A man in a dark suit stood up and declared loudly that this was an insult to the memory of the true owners. $280 from the lady, the auctioneer finally said, his voice betraying a mixture of surprise and growing nervousness. The tension in the room was palpable, as if the air had become thicker and harder to breathe. A union officer stood up and declared with authority that the auction would proceed according to federal laws, regardless of the participant's race, but this only intensified the hostile murmurs. Mary could feel hatred radiating from several people in the room, a hostility that went far beyond simple surprise. "Does anyone offer more than $280? Asked the auctioneer, his voice now visibly tense. Some of those present seemed to be considering making bids just to prevent Mary from getting the property, but the amount was substantial, and purely racial motivation did not justify the expense. The crowd remained in tense silence. Some of those present seemed too shocked to react. Others clearly calculated whether it was worth spending their own money just to prevent a black woman from buying the property. There were also those who recognized the powerful symbolism of the moment and chose not to interfere, whether out of principle or morbid curiosity. $200 once, announced the auctioneer, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Sweat was visible on his forehead despite the morning cold. $280 twice. During this pause, Mary could hear her own heart beating. Decades of planning, months of saving, a lifetime of suffering. Everything came down to this moment. She maintained an upright posture, a steady gaze, even feeling the weight of hostile looks that pierced her like daggers. A man in the front row stood up abruptly and shouted, "This is blasphemy! A Negro buying the Bell House!" Others joined the protest, their voices rising in a chorus of indignation that echoed through the courthouse walls. The union officer pounded his fist on the table and ordered silence, threatening to remove anyone who disturbed the legal process. But the tension continued to grow, like a pressure cooker about to explode. Mary could feel she was at the center of something much larger than a simple real estate transaction. What followed was tumult. Voices rose in furious protest, chairs were pushed, some men stood up as if they were going to physically confront Mary. The union officer immediately called for reinforcements, and armed soldiers positioned themselves strategically throughout the room. Mary remained seated, motionless as a statue, while chaos unfolded around her. She had bought the house where she had been enslaved, but the real price was just beginning to reveal itself. The hostility she felt was almost physical, a tangible force that threatened to suffocate her. The auctioneer, with visibly trembling hands, prepared buyer's certificate number 6, a document that officialized the property transfer. When he handed the paper to Mary, some in the crowd booed and shouted threats that Union soldiers quickly silenced. "This won't end here," shouted a man before being escorted out by soldiers. "That Negro is going to discover that paper doesn't protect anyone in this city." Mary carefully folded the certificate and stored it in her bag. Her movements were deliberately calm despite the tumult around her. She had expected hostility, but the intensity of the reaction surprised her. It was as if her purchase had wounded something much deeper than pride. It had touched the very heart of white supremacy. When Mary finally stood up to leave, an ominous silence descended over the room. All eyes followed her as she walked toward the door, discreetly escorted by Union soldiers. Each step was loaded with meaning, each movement observed and judged. Outside the courthouse, small groups of people formed, whispering and pointing at Mary. The news spread through the city with the speed of fire. A formerly enslaved woman had bought her former master's mansion. For some, it was an affront to the natural order of things. For others, it was divine justice finally manifesting. But for Mary, it was just the first step in a journey she knew would be dangerous. As she walked through Beaufort streets toward her new property, she could feel hostile looks from windows, hear whispered comments on corners. The entire city seemed to be watching, waiting to see what would happen next. When Mary arrived at the Carter house that afternoon, carrying the deed in her hands, a small crowd had already gathered across the street. Some were simply curious, but others clearly hostile. She could hear fragments of conversations. Won't last a week. Someone needs to teach a lesson. This is what happens when you give too much freedom. The front door key was hidden in the same place it had always been. Mary knew all the house's secrets. But this time, when she turned the key in the lock, the sound was different. It was the sound of freedom materializing in metal and wood, but also the sound of a declaration of war against everything Beaufort represented. Entering through the front door was a revolutionary act that did not go unnoticed by observers. For decades, Mary had used only the back entrances, the service corridors, the secondary stairs. Now she walked through the main hall as owner, and each step was an affront to the values that had governed the city for generations. Each room told a different story of her past life. But now these spaces had new meanings. The kitchen where she had prepared thousands of meals, the parlor where she had served in silence, the bedrooms she had cleaned tirelessly. All were her spaces now to use as she wished, to modify according to her will. But even while exploring her new property, Mary was aware that she had crossed a line from which there was no return. The house purchase was not just a real estate transaction. It was a declaration that the old social order was dead, that a new reality had been born, and there were many people in Beaufort who were not willing to accept this new reality without a fight. That first night in her new house, Mary barely slept, not because of the excitement of victory, but because of the sounds she heard from outside. Footsteps in the street, whispered voices, occasionally the sound of stones being thrown against the windows. The hostility she had felt at the courthouse was just the beginning. During the following weeks, social pressure on Mary intensified. Merchants refused to sell to her. Neighbors ostentatiously ignored her. White children threw stones at her windows. It was a systematic intimidation campaign designed to force her to give up her property and return to her place. But Mary had survived decades of much more direct oppression. She knew how to resist pressure, how to maintain dignity in the face of hostility, how to transform others' hatred into fuel for her own determination. Each act of hostility only strengthened her resolve to remain and prosper. Mary had not just bought a house, she had bought her own symbolic liberation. She had transformed the symbol of her oppression into a symbol of her victory. She had rewritten the narrative of her own life so radically that it challenged all social conventions of the time. When dawn broke after her first night as owner, Mary woke not as Mary Thompson, the formerly enslaved, but as Mary Carter Thompson, owner of one of Beaufort's most prestigious mansions. It was a complete metamorphosis of identity, status, and future possibilities. Mary had proven that true revenge was not in destruction, but in transformation. It was not in tearing down the system, but in using it for her own purposes. It was not in fleeing from her past, but in completely redefining it. Mary Thompson's story does not end with the purchase of the Carter house. In fact, that was just the beginning of a transformation that would echo through generations. In the following years, she transformed the mansion into a center of prosperity for her family, proving that true freedom was not just in the absence of chains, but in the ability to completely rewrite one's own destiny. Her son Samuel became pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, educator, and respected community leader. The other children prospered in their professions, each building on the foundation of dignity and possibility that Mary had established with her audacious purchase. The family that was once listed as abandoned property now owned properties, businesses, and social influence. When Mary died in 1884 at 87 years old, she had lived to see a complete transformation not only of her own condition, but of the entire society around her. The woman who was born as property died as owner, leaving a legacy that challenged all expectations about what was possible for someone in her condition. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of her story is what it reveals about the nature of power and resistance. Mary did not win through violence or direct confrontation. She won through patience, observation, meticulous planning, and the ability to recognize opportunities when they presented themselves. The Carter House still exists today at 412 Federal Street in Beaufort. Visitors pass by it without knowing they are before a monument to the most sophisticated form of resistance ever documented. Not a resistance of blood, but of reclaimed dignity. What makes Mary Thompson's story truly disturbing is not the violence she suffered, but the psychological violence she inflicted on the system that tried to destroy her. She used the very tools of oppression, money, property, laws, to free herself so completely that she transformed her condition from victim to victor. For decades, she had been forced to know every intimate detail of her oppressors' lives. She knew their weaknesses, their fears, their most private routines. When the opportunity arose, she used this knowledge not to destroy them physically, but for something much more devastating. She made them completely irrelevant to her own happiness and success. Mary's true genius lay in understanding that the most profound form of resistance was not making her former masters suffer, but making them completely unnecessary for her life. She no longer needed them for anything, not for work, not for shelter, not for identity, not for validation. Today, when we walk through Beaufort streets and observe the historic mansions that attract tourists from around the world, we rarely stop to consider the hidden stories their walls keep. How many other people like Mary lived and died in silence, their stories lost forever? How many other extraordinary transformations happened without leaving traces in official records? Mary Carter Thompson's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about human nature, that sometimes the most devastating resistance does not come through violence, but through demonstrating that we are capable of completely transcending those who tried to diminish us. She proved that true freedom is not in escaping our past, but in redefining it so completely that it becomes the foundation of our victory, not the weight of our defeat. Mary Thompson did not just buy a house. She bought the complete rewriting of her own history. And perhaps that is the most disturbing lesson of all, that within each of us exists the capacity to transform our greatest humiliation into our greatest victory, if we have the patience, intelligence, and courage necessary to wait for the right moment and act with surgical precision. The Carter House remains as a silent witness that sometimes the most powerful resistance makes no noise. It simply rewrites history. And in those walls, among those columns, still echoes the sound of the footsteps of a woman who proved that true power is not in oppressing others, but in freeing oneself so completely that oppression becomes just a distant memory, transformed into fuel for a victory that no one can reverse. What an incredible journey, through a story that redefines resilience and victory. If Mary Thompson's tale inspired you, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our weekly dives into history's most gripping stories. Comment below, what part of Mary's story moved you the most, and where are you watching from? Until next time, keep seeking the stories that change how we see the world.